Hello again, and welcome to the Castle Old Skull Hawk Moor project, where we explore the deepest roots of Dungeons & Dragons in search of greater understanding and forgotten details that we can use to move forward into the future of old-school-inspired game design. The Hawk Moor project celebrates the world of Greyhawk, as created by Gary Gygax, as well as the world of Blackmoor, as created by Dave Arneson, and all of their gaming friends and co-creators. Today, we are going to discuss the evil dark elves, the Drow, from an historical perspective. To quote the Edda of centuries ago, pardon my Old Norse, Doc Alfar Eru Svartari en Bik. They go by many names: the Drow, Svartalfar, the Black Elves, the Dark Elves, Doc Alfar, perhaps Gary Gygax's finest racial and character concept ever established for the world of Greyhawk. In our current politically charged climate of corporate incompetence, franchise destruction, culture wars, shaming, cancellation, and emotional arguments, it has become exceedingly popular to regard these dark elves, the Drow, as a misunderstood and oppressed subculture of keenly sensitive victims who are unfairly maligned by others, prejudiced people who are simply not enlightened enough to understand them, which is interesting because the vast majority of old-school Drow, as written and created by Gary Gygax in early 1978, are thoroughly, inherently, innately evil underworld dwellers who equate heroes and champions of goodness with the enemy. Gygax created the Drow of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons via direct inspiration of many centuries of mythic and folkloric source material. He did not create them to be do-gooders. He created them to be iconic villains, more like Darth Vader or Thulsa Doom. The Drow were created to be worthy, dark magic-wielding enemies that the players would love to hate. This creative endeavor was made with meticulous care, crafted from beloved source material by Gary Gygax, and it tends to get wildly obfuscated these days what he was intending with his creations. People these days like to say that the Drow are beyond good and evil, but they never seem to be able to back up their emotional opinions with historical facts pertaining to the exact source material that the Dark Elves were lifted from. It is easy to fall into this trap if we don't research the deep and dark history from the beginning. And the fact is, people these days tend to get very angry about associating evil with a person's appearance or nature. But the fact that Drow are evil or spawned of evil is most easily demonstrated as true if we approach their tales and creation in a meticulous chronological sequence. Circa 1220 AD, the Prose Edda. And so we begin almost exactly 800 years ago with the major surviving works of Norse mythology. One of the most important key texts in Norse mythology is the Snorra Edda, known these days as the Prose Edda. The earlier English translations of this amazing 13th century work tend to be the most accurate because a lot of modern translators tend to put their own kinder, gentler, and potentially misleading, prejudiced imprint upon some of the more questionable material hidden away therein. A good translation of the Gylfaginning subtome within the Snorra Edda, where the scant information on Dark Elves is to be found, can be noted in the 1916 translation by Arthur Gilchrist Brodeur. There, of the Dark Alfar of the underworld region of Svartalfar Heimar, the home of the Black Elves, we read as follows, to quote, "Many places are there, and glorious. That which is called Alfheimar is one, where dwell the peoples called Light Elves, or Ljos Alfar. But the Dark Elves, or Dok Alfar, dwell down in the earth, and they are unlike in appearance, but by far more unlike in nature. The Light Elves are fairer to look upon than the sun, but the Dark Elves are blacker than pitch." Unquote. Note that this passage isn't just talking about the darkness in the Dark Elves' hearts. It is defining their appearance and inherent nature, their very essence. It is also talking about the way they look and saying that Light Elves are fair and radiant, while Dark Elves are very much their opposite. This does not necessarily refer to skin color. It might refer to shadows, dark clothing, or mantles of blinding dark magic. But one thing is certain, the Dark Elves, however they look, are dark to look upon. Darkness is inherent to their appearance. We now move on to circa 1660 AD and Odin's Ravengaldir. Another slight allusion to the Dark Elves is found in the poem Hrafnagaldir Odins, which means Odin's Raven Spell, where we find this interesting quote. To quote, "At Jormungrun's northern border, under the outermost root of the noble tree, went to their couches giantesses and giants, Nair, which means the corpses of dead men, Dvergar, which means dwarves, and Dok Alfar, which means dark elves." Unquote. While there is only a precious trace of information here, it is intriguing that we find a glimpse of giants, slain men, dwarves, and Dok Alfar all being mentioned in the same sentence. The Norse words for undead, such as Draugr, Hogbui, Aptergongu Mater, and the like, are not found here in this text. It specifically says Nair, which means dead bodies. So this might be one of the spots where Gary Gygax would associate giants and dark elves with human sacrifice, although I cannot be certain if he ever read Odin's Raven Spell, the poem, because it is very obscure even today, and might have been even more so in the 1970s. We now move on to 1835 and the Deutsche Mythology, or Teutonic mythology. One of the strongest early analyses of Norse mythology was written by Jacob Grimm, of Brothers Grimm fame. This is the Deutsche Mythology of 1835. This massive book is still regarded as an authority on the subject. Grimm's opinions are often refuted these days, and he was highly opinionated. But here's something interesting that he said about the Light Elves and the Dark Elves. To quote, "Some have seen in this antithesis of light and black elves the same dualism that other mythologies set up between spirits good and bad, friendly and hostile, heavenly and hellish, between angels of light and darkness." Unquote. According to Grimm, in this interpretation, which he himself is not certain that he embraces, he just knows that others believe in it, just as fairy elves are embodiments of good and light and divinity, dark elves seem to be embodiments of evil and darkness and infernal powers. Jacob Grimm, by the way, further wanted to draw a further distinction between the dark elves and the black elves, specifically the Dok Alfar and the Svart Alfar, as the dusky and black elves, but his theory is not fully supported in later decades to my knowledge. Some scholars have a hesitance toward associating the light elves with heaven and the dark elves with hell, because while the Norse mythos did experience a strong Christian influence, many of the tales are much older than that. Many such shards of the old ways were not well recorded or have been lost forever. This passage by Grimm might be where Gary Gygax, who did not want to put fallen angels into Dungeons and Dragons because of his personal religious beliefs, decided that the Dark Elves were chaotic demon worshippers rather than being devilish and satanic. And again, we read Grimm explaining that light elves are beautiful and radiant with powers of goodness, and dark elves are their opposite in all of these qualities. Gygax was not being racist when he made the Greyhawk Drow dark-skinned. He was following the Norse mythology recorded by Snorri, or in the Odin's Ravenspell. The dark elves are Nordic. They were born of the Norse mythos of Scandinavia, but they are also dark-appearing and also evil, as is their nature. We next move on to the year 1855. There is another major source from the 1800s that we should consider here, and it is written in English. In his great work, Age of Fable, Thomas Bulfinch, still to this day perhaps the most monumental scholar of mythology, briefly addressed the matter of light and dark elves, although he conflated Dvergar and Alfar. Many scholars do this, particularly because of the Sons of Ivaldi and considerations of smith work and the Dok-Alfar, Svartalfar confusion. He described their appearances as being dwarf-like. This is not uncommon. Interpreters of Norse mythology often confuse dwarves, elves, dark elves, black elves, and many other subraces that are not very well described. Bulfinch's description is worth taking a look at because it is very likely that Gary Gygax read it and considered it. It reads as follows, to quote, "The Edda mentions another class of beings inferior to the gods, but still possessed of great power. These were called elves. The white spirits, or elves of light, were exceedingly fair, more brilliant than the sun, and clad in garments of a delicate and transparent texture. They loved the light. They were kindly disposed to mankind, and generally appeared as fair and lovely children. Their country was called Alfheim, and was the domain of Freyr, the god of the sun, in whose light they were always sporting. The black elves, or night elves, were a different kind of creature. They were ugly, long-nosed dwarves, of a dirty brown color. They appeared only at night, for they avoided the sun as their most deadly enemy, because whenever the sun's beams fell upon any of them, they changed them immediately into stones. Their language was the echo of solitudes, and their dwelling places subterranean caves and clefts. They were supposed to have come into existence as maggots produced by the decaying flesh of Ymir's body, and were afterwards endowed by the gods with a human form and great understanding. They were particularly distinguished for a knowledge of the mysterious powers of nature, and for the runes which they carved and explained." Unquote. Here we find many of Gary Gygax's potential inspirations for the oft-forgotten silent sign language and battle codes of the Drow. Their language was the echo of solitudes. We also see confirmation of their netherworld nature, magic, runes, sigils, and hatred of the sunlight. And next, we move forward to 1940 and the Roaring Trumpet. Now that we have considered these foundations of Dark Elven mythology, we can advance into the 20th century. As Gary Gygax often noted, the classic fantasy novella The Roaring Trumpet by L. Sprague de Camp and Fletcher Pratt was the most direct inspiration for the G Giant and D Drow series of D&D dungeon modules. King Snor's Hall of the Fire Giants and their troll allies is pulled almost directly from this story. Most particularly, the prison and smithy themes of dungeon levels 2 and 3 are present in Gary Gygax's work as almost exact echoes of the roaring trumpet's most compelling scenes of dark fantasy. DeCamp and Pratt seem to have followed the Bullfinch interpretation of the Dark Elves, but the relevant passage is very important because it is probably the reason why Gary Gygax tied the Drow to the fire giants in Alliance. It reads as follows, to quote, "They turned from the ledge into another tunnel. This sloped up, then leveled again, where side tunnels branched in from several directions. Snog, a troll character, picked his way unerringly through the maze. A tremendous banging noise grew on them, and they were passing the entrance of some kind of giant's armory. The limits of this place were invisible in the flickering red glare, through which scuttled naked black things like licorice dolls. Heimdall whispered, 'These would be dark dwarves from Svart Alfheim, where no man nor Aes,' singular for Aesir, 'has ever been.'" Unquote. Gary Gygax would perhaps later revisit this interpretation of evil allied dark dwarves, which might be one of the inspirations for his later creation of the Dvergar, a separate Advanced Dungeons & Dragons race in the Monster Manual 2, who share the Netherworld origins with the Drow. There are other 20th century sources, for example the Shadow People, which we will discuss another day. But we can already see through all of these sources that the Dark Elves are dark in complexion, dark in appearance, evil, and memorable enemies. Exactly how evil they are, I am not going to go into just yet because I'm not certain, honestly, how potential censors or critics might react toward all of the direct evidence I have from Gary's earliest works concerning the Dark Elves and their nature. Perhaps in the future. But as you can already see, we learn a lot more about the game of Dungeons & Dragons when we dig into its depths, rather than just glossing things over and trying to change history simply to be more polite. D&D is not just about adventure. It is about the champions who serve as mortal instruments in the eternal war between holy good and unholy evil, good spirits versus devils and demons, good heroes versus evil villains. Evil cannot be defeated by pretending that it does not exist. Evil is defeated through fatal confrontation, particularly when evil is least prepared to deal with it. And evil thrives when its nature is changed in conversation or simply ignored. In a future episode of the Hawk Moor History series, we will dig more deeply into the origins of the innately evil Drow as they appear throughout the first classic and iconic old school works of 1975 to 1978 D&D and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Stay tuned. Until then, enjoy your adventures in the Gygaxian and Arnisonian underworld, and I look forward to our next meeting. Take care.